Heading south of the Mason-Dixon, this is the Week in Review at the Abbeville Institute. Here is your host, Brian McClanahan.
Welcome back to the Week in Review at the Abbeville Institute. This is your host, Brian McClanahan, and this is episode 210, covering the week of March 23rd through March 27th, 2020. Glad to have you back on the program. Very glad to be here. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter at Abbeville Institute, like our Facebook page at Abbeville Institute, and subscribe to our YouTube page at Abbeville Institute. You can find all those social media accounts at our webpage, abbevilleinstitute.org. While you're there, give us an email address. We'll give you a a new free ebook, The Southern Tradition. Exploring the Southern Tradition, is the title of the book. It's by 20 Abbeville Institute scholars. It's a great free ebook. Now, if you've already subscribed to the email list and you want this free ebook, just go ahead and subscribe again. We are going to be migrating our email list over, so you're still going to get your Daily Dose of Dixie through the other email address for the time being, but when we migrate it, you're going to get the new one. So go ahead and do that now if you want that free ebook. It's a great book, and I think you'll enjoy it. Also, don't forget we exist on your generous contributions alone, so if you like the podcast, the website, all the things we do, please consider a contribution to the Institute. It is tax deductible to the full extent of the law, so just click on that support tab at the abbevilleinstitute.org, and you can see donor options, and it's a new donor interface. It's a lot nicer. We've got some upgrades we're doing, and all of your donations are helping do all of this stuff. So, that said, if you want to donate monthly, annually, one-time gift, it's all available for you. We've got other ways to give as well, so lots of great ways to support the Institute, and please consider doing so. Also, please share our material around on social media. If you like this podcast, rate it wherever you get your podcast. Download our free mobile application. Get the Abbeville Institute on the go. Just go to your app store and look for Abbeville Institute. It should come up. So you've got all kinds of ways to keep in touch with the Institute and help us explore what is true and valuable in the Southern tradition. All right, well, let's talk about the material for the week. Of course, this is a strange time. We've mentioned it before. It's a strange time. We are living in a period of time that I think maybe 20, 30, 40 years from now, people are going to look back on, or longer even, and say this was perhaps a turning point in American history. Most of the United States has now been shut down. The economy has been shut down. The federal government passed one of the largest bills in the history of the United States, if not, it was the largest spending bill in the history of the United States, $2 trillion. The Federal Reserve is pumping as much as $4 trillion into the economy. So we've got a $6 trillion stimulus. And no one blinks an eye. States have gone in and acted like states and said, okay, we're going to do these things because it doesn't matter what the federal government says. We're going to try to keep our citizens safe. And this is happening all over the United States. We're seeing a revitalization of federalism. And who knows what the United States is going to look like in a month or two or 3 months or 4 months. And I mentioned this on the podcast last week, and because of that, I wrote a piece about it for Monday, how the Southern tradition can save America. And I want to start with that, and then I'm going to get into the other four pieces, because the other four really work together. Actually, the Thursday piece on film kind of works with what I'm talking about on the Monday piece. But I mentioned in this particular piece that perhaps the Southern tradition can offer a blueprint in some ways for saving America. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, well, America's not gone. I mean, it's still here. And this is true. America, politically, legally, economically, has had problems for decades. But when I say how the Southern tradition can save America, I'm talking about culturally, perhaps politically. The South, of course, wasn't the only section to hang on to federalism. The North used it too. But the South hung on to it longer and stronger than any other section in the United States. And so when we're looking at how these governors are responding to this crisis, it doesn't matter whether you're talking about New York or California or Alabama or South Carolina or Florida. It doesn't matter. Take your pick of a state. It doesn't matter. The governors are responding in the way that governors should respond. And perhaps what we're going to see is a revitalization of this idea of political decentralization. People don't trust the general government to make the appropriate choices to do what's right for the United States. In fact, I think what the coronavirus has done, the Chinese virus, the Wuhan virus, whatever you want to call it, what this virus has done is exposed the inability of the central government to really do much of anything productive. except make demands and cause chaos. And so perhaps people are going to talk about decentralization. They might talk about secession, nullification, at least real federalism. Because if this thing gets any worse, and it's supposed to, all evidence points that the peak of this pandemic will not hit till the middle to the end of April. And the jury is still out on how bad it is. I mean, we don't know how many people actually have the coronavirus and don't show any signs and symptoms or anything. I mean, this is a strange virus. We're in strange times. Nobody really knows what's going on. But of course, governors are responding. I've read in Hawaii, and I put it in the piece, Hawaii has said that if you come in from another state, you're going to be quarantined no matter what. And Hawaii can do that. These states could have shut down their airports immediately and said, we're not going to allow anyone in from anywhere else. The states could control who comes in and out of the states. This is all highly possible. The states have all the power in this particular game. It's not really a game. It's a dangerous situation. The states have all the power, and I think they're starting to realize they can use it. The governor of Florida, DeSantis, was whining that he didn't have authority to shut down the public beaches. Of course he did. He could have done anything he wanted. He could have shut down restaurants, bars, because as long as it doesn't violate the state constitution of Florida, he could have done this. And so this revitalization of federalism, whether it's draconian or not, I think what we're seeing is that people are starting to say, well, why don't we protect California? Why don't we protect Florida? Why don't we protect Alabama or New York or North Dakota? Why don't we protect our state, our region, our city, our people from this virus the best we can and stop looking to the United States government in Washington, D.C. for solutions and answers? And so that was part of what I said where the Southern tradition can save America, a revitalization of federalism, a real interest in local self-government, which, of course, is part of the Southern tradition. I also mentioned that many Southerners are better prepared for this than Americans in other regions. You know, it's, of course, Hank Williams, A Country Boy Can't Survive. I've seen this several times now online, people using that to say, hey, this is the South, this is what we can do. In fact, there was one of the Alabama websites used that. Of course, Hank Williams is from Alabama. And these rural areas, which of course were considered flyover country, maybe they have a better response to these things. They're safe havens. This isn't mere speculation. You look at the hot spots in America, and it's urban areas. New York City, Los Angeles, Seattle, perhaps New Orleans now. But it's urban areas, so these rural areas of the South might be safe havens. And of course, people that have either prepped, they're preppers, and preppers were always made fun of, but now who's laughing as these people had food, water, supplies already stored up. They didn't matter. I have a friend who lives in Utah. He's a Mormon, and they prep all the time. He said, look, I've got it. I don't have to worry about anything right now. I'm not making a dash for anything. I've got it all already. So preppers, of course, other things, ammunition, hunting, fishing supplies, things like that. Maybe you grow your food on your own property. I mean, these are things that are beneficial. And of course, Southerners being self-reliant, rugged individualists, many of them, not all, of course, there's plenty of people in the South that don't have that. But a lot of Southerners do, and so that's going to work to their advantage. And of course, this is the agrarian tradition. This is what they were talking about, and I'll take my stand. Who owns America? These were the things that they were pointing out. The anti-industrial urban society. And I put a quote in here from Thomas Jefferson from 1800. He wrote, I view great cities as as pestilence, right? But the pestilence to the morals, the health, and the liberties of man. True, they nourish some of the elegant arts, but the useful ones can thrive elsewhere, and less perfection in the others with more health, virtue, and freedom would be my choice. So, pestilence comes to the cities. Pestilential is the word he used, but this is what he meant. And of course, every student in America now is homeschooling. Now, homeschooling is a difficult thing to do. It's not the solution for everyone. It's not the be-all, end-all. It's hard. But this opens the door to other things. Maybe people are looking for, as their kids come home and they can't send them out to the government school and they can't get them indoctrinated anymore, maybe they're looking at other things. Online resources, things like the Abbeville Institute. They're looking at places to go where they can get information so they can help supplement their students and get them a real education. Maybe they're looking at the classics. They're looking at reading more. They're trying to do things to try to expand their horizons, not being tied into some stupid government curriculum. Maybe this will lead to a cultural and social renaissance. Families have to spend more time together. This might strengthen bonds of family intimacy, maybe between a marriage or children. I mean, look, these are good things. Of course, this is not unique to the South, as I point out, but Southerners really do understand that family is the basis of community. And of course, when you think of music, and people are doing all kinds of music, I look on social media, there's these open mics, and people are just playing music all the time to try to keep people's spirits up. Well, that's all Southern. Film. And of course, this is where Clyde's piece comes in on Thursday. The 15 essays in this particular series, A Southerner's Movie Guide. I mean, this is great. You've got 15 essays that point out the things you should be watching and not watching. You've got time on your hands, perhaps, to watch some things. Spend time with your family. Spend time with your children and watch some of these movies. One of the movies this week is just fantastic, and I'll talk about it here in a minute. But I conclude the piece by saying the Southern tradition, with its reliance on faith, family, self-determination, independence, and localism, offers an attractive counterweight to the glaring problems of the modern world. And the Wuhan virus has only magnified the situation. This virus might lead to the end of the modern United States, but it won't lead to the end of America. Real America has always existed in the South, and that will never be more clear than the coming difficult months, and I think that's true. How are people going to react, and how are people going to survive in this particular time period? But that said, we've got the Southerner's Movie Guide Part 15, and one of the films, Intruder in the Dust, is just fantastic. If you've seen To Kill a Mockingbird, you would like Intruder in the Dust. In fact, it's so much better. It's so much better. It's just a fantastic piece of filmmaking, and not just that, a great story. The good and bad of the South, the good, bad, and the ugly of the South. People doing the right thing in difficult circumstances. The complexity of Southern society. I think that's the key to this particular film. And we actually have, it's on YouTube, so we've got a link to it. You can watch the whole film for free from YouTube. But this was focusing on Faulkner and what Faulkner added to the cinema, what he added to Hollywood. And of course, it's not just his stories, but he also directed. We have a link to The Road to Glory, which is a Faulkner work. It's about French soldiers in World War I. He also tells you some of the Faulkner pieces to miss. But these are things we could be doing right now as in families, enriching our lives, doing some things like this to try to increase the reach of the Southern cultural tradition. And this is the important thing about it. When people talk about the Southern tradition, the snarks will say, "Whoa, what do you mean? Race and slavery?" No, it's things like Faulkner. It's things like independence, decentralization. These are the things we're talking about that matter. These are the true and valuable things in the tradition that matter for an uncertain world. In an uncertain world, what is the world going to look like? Now, that brings us to the piece on Tuesday. When we publish this book review, it's a review of a book that's awful. And so every now and then we'll review a book you shouldn't read. And you shouldn't read this book unless you just want to have your stomach turn and you want to get angry. I mean, it is a book that people are talking about, though. Essentially what this particular philosopher, this writer, has done is attach the Southern tradition to Nazi Germany. And what she says is that, look, Southerners can learn something from the Germans because the Germans have had this history of Nazism and they have to somehow deal with it. And how do they do it? And the review is by David Gordon, who's a senior fellow at the Mises Institute. And he's sympathetic to the Southern side of things. He is not in favor of political correctness at all. And at the end of the piece, and so when we put it out, people were very upset about this piece. And I don't think they really got to the end of it. And they needed to get to the end of it. Because he says, look, you're not guilty for things that your ancestors did in any way. You don't hold any guilt for that. There's nothing to apologize for. At all. There's nothing to apologize for. This is not something that you should have to work through as a society, as this particular philosopher suggests, that we should have to work through this guilt in the South for things that happened 150 or 200 years ago. It's not something that needs to be done. In fact, it's counterproductive. Even if you look at, this is an idea of corruption of blood, right? I mean, this is an old idea from English law. It used to be that if you were arrested, then your family, it was called corruption of blood. Your family could have their property removed. I mean, they could also face consequences for your acts, corruption of blood. But we decided, in the Anglo-American tradition, we decided that was a bad idea. You're not responsible for the acts of your parents, your grandparents, any of those, unless you're directly involved in it. You're not responsible for any of that. And so someone who's sitting in 2020 who had a slave owner from 1860 is not responsible for the actions of a slave owner in the 1860s in any way, and should not have to apologize for anything that their family did at all. And this plays right into the idea of the social justice warrior campaign to tear down everything in the South. You are guilty by default because you have reverence for your ancestors. That is not just stupid, it's evil. It's evil. It's trying to distance people from where they come from, but not just that. It's trying to say you are guilty of their sins because you are born from them. So the question is, do other societies have to deal with this? Of course they don't. It's really just in the South. Now, I know this is going on in other parts of the world as well, because we've had people contact us from other parts of the world saying, you know what? They're doing this in Europe. They're doing this in Australia. They're doing this in Africa. They're doing it wherever. They're doing it in these places too, because it builds on this idea of guilt. That you should feel guilty for something that happened that you had no control over. And just because you might admire your ancestors doesn't mean you would do the exact same things as your ancestors. You can say that, well, I mean, I wouldn't be a slave owner. My ancestors might have owned slaves, but so what? Right? I wouldn't do that now if you had ancestors who were slave owners. But it doesn't mean I'm going to lose my reverence for these people. It doesn't mean I'm going to call them all kinds of names. You see, this is where we if you do these things, you buy into the leftist narrative. You essentially are validating Eric Foner. You're validating the social justice warriors by criticizing these people for something that was accepted at the time period. I mean, do we criticize the Greeks for being slave owners? If you read Aristotle, it's loaded. If you read Aristotle's Politics, it is loaded with references to slavery. Do we criticize the Romans for being slave owners? We can say, well, I mean, there was a brutal slaveholding society, but yet we don't ever talk about, well, Caesar, we shouldn't even use the term Caesar anymore. In fact, just saying Caesar salad should be illegal because that should trigger someone because Caesar was a slave owner. Of course, it's not named after the same guy, but people don't know that. So the word Caesar. What about government czars? It's built on the word Caesar, also totalitarian Russian dictators who own slaves. So should we get rid, the government uses the word czar. Should we use that? Well, Wilson used the term dictator, but then we went to czar because people don't know what that means. So should we get rid of that word? These are questions that, of course, nobody asks. But if you say anything about, well, we got the Richard B. Russell building and Senate building, we need to change that because Richard B. Russell was a segregationist. That was the accepted social order of the day. Or we can't, John C. Calhoun, we can't mention Calhoun. If you have to whisper his name, Calhoun. Because if you say Calhoun, well, I mean, I was just watching someone I like talk about Calhoun the other day, and it was essentially, well, Calhoun was a brilliant speaker, but my gosh, the guy was just despicable. His personality was awful. I mean, again, I like this individual. I'm not going to say who it is, but this is short-sighted. It's buying into the social justice narrative of America. You have no guilt for what your ancestors did. Zero. If you weren't complicit in it, if you didn't go and do it yourself, there's no reason to apologize or show guilt for anything. And if Americans would just stand up and say, you know what, I'm not guilty about it. I don't feel guilty about that. That just happened. So what? Go on with your little whining self. I remember, Michael Martin, who writes for us, used to carry around a sign and has a person on there, and show me where the statue hurt you on your body. Of course, I mean these are just whiny little petulant crybabies. They're children, and they're acting as such. Even the ones that are older, they're children. And we ran a piece on Wednesday about Nathan Bedford Forrest, and this also factors into this because I received an email about this. Hey, I love the piece up until we got to the part where we started talking about Forrest and the Klan. Now, you can't do a biography of Forrest. It was a mini biography of Nathan Bedford Forrest without talking about that particular part of his life, the post-war Forrest and the post-war South, the Reconstruction South. Now, when I teach that particular time period, I often say, well, look, you can understand both sides of the particular situation. You've got one side that had political power, that controlled society, that now has been disfranchised. They are now out of power. Their property has been confiscated, stolen, whatever. I mean, their taxes are too high. They've suffered tremendous social loss. When you had 75% of the white Southern population fighting in the war and you had large numbers of casualties, there's tremendous social loss. An amount of social loss we can't even fathom. We're talking about coronavirus. We've had 1,000 people die from that, and that's tragic. Imagine if you had 1 million people die with a much smaller population, how tragic that would be, both North and South. That was total casualties, North and South. And of course, that's not all deaths, but casualties. People that cannot be productive in society anymore. Think about the social cost of that, or the economic cost, the tremendous economic cost of the war in the South. So you've got one group of people that are now shoved down into the mud. You have another group of people, and of course, they're going to fight to get the vote back, control back. This is what they're going to do. It's a natural thing. These are men of action. They're not just going to sit on their hands. Americans nowadays will do that. But not in 1865 or 1866 or 1867. They're not going to do it. On the other hand, you've got a group of people that were either enslaved or they were not given the vote. Now, what's interesting about the South, of course, is that blacks could vote in the South in some states until the early 1800s. And then that changed. But you certainly have a large section of the population that could not vote for whatever reason, whether they just couldn't vote, they were free and they couldn't vote, or whether they were slaves and couldn't vote, had no political power, really no economic power. They couldn't own property legally. Now they can. I mean, there's things that are happening for that segment of the population, black Southerners, that were, in their mind, of course, very beneficial. And you can understand why they would think that. It was beneficial for them. And they're going to fight to maintain that, whether it's through the union leagues or other groups, other ways to do it. They're going to fight to maintain their power. So you've got a natural collision course. This is why Lincoln, to the very end of his life, was in favor of colonization, because he did not want to see that happen in the South. That's the dirty little secret about Abraham Lincoln. He did not think the races could get together in the post-war South, that there would be strife, there would be violence, whether it's economic, military, whatever the case may be. So we had a very dangerous situation because of the fact that we had society turned upside down in so many different ways. And people are going to react to that violently at times. Now, there is a new book about the Klan by a woman named Parsons, I believe. And she basically says the Klan was a made-up thing, that it really didn't exist that much. It was a boogeyman for the North, and they used it to punish the South. But you couldn't really find a lot of it. And there was, if you read different sources, you can see there were instances where some of these things that were going on in the South that were documented were happening. And so Southerners responded. So you can't take that away from a story of Forrest. And what are you supposed to do? Just pull out the Eric Faulkner line and criticize Forrest for everything he did? You're writing a biography of Forrest. You're going to talk about it from looking at what Forrest's participation in these things. Why was he getting involved? Why did he think this was something that should have been done? And of course, he also gets into the Fort Pillow massacre and quote-unquote massacre and how that wasn't really much of a massacre at all. There's all kinds of things that are good about this essay. It's by Neil Kumar. But this is one of the most politically incorrect essays on Forrest you're going to, in the modern time, you're going to read. Now, of course, if you read old biographies of Forrest, you're going to find this stuff. But now everything about Forrest is how bad he was, how evil the man was. Just like Calhoun. Everything you read on Calhoun, he's an evil guy. He's evil. He might be brilliant, but he's a brilliant evil man. Or an evil brilliant man, whatever the case may be. You're buying into the leftist narrative of America. They've already won if that's how you're going to describe things. They've already won. Because you've conceded the entire field to them. Again, you do not have to apologize for what people did 150 years ago. There's no apology necessary. At all. You don't have to apologize for what people did 10 or 15 years ago if you were not part of it. There's no apology necessary. This is when Obama went on his apology tour. I mean, Obama's apology tour when he was president around the world, apologizing for the sins of the United States, and there are many. And there's no doubt about it. The United States has done some pretty awful things at times, but I was not part of that. If you're listening to this podcast, you probably weren't part of that. So why should anyone apologize? Why should Obama go bow before the Japanese and say, we're sorry for that? Horrible thing. We can sit here and say, well, we can talk about the atomic weapon strike on Japan, but should anybody have to apologize for that in 2020, unless they were directly a part of the process? And I wasn't even close to being born yet in 1945. I know some people that listen to this podcast were born at that time, but you were probably young and you probably were not part of that. Even if you were, should there be an apology? So, and of course, on the flip side of that, the North never apologizes. The South deserved every bit of punishment they got. And this factors into the Friday piece. The take 'em down trend goes to New Jersey now. And we've already talked about this a little bit, how there's a push to remove a Union general statue from the Capitol building because they want to replace it with a more politically correct individual, a woman. And of course, this happened in Florida. Everything that happened in Florida, it all came on the back end of the Black Lives Matter movement, the Me Too movement, whatever social justice movement you can think of. The Antifa groups, they're all out pushing this narrative that these things have to come down. And people thought for a time, and we've said it before, well, it's not going to happen. We're not going to take down Union veterans. Why would we do that? Those are the good guys. All the neoconservatives, well, I mean, sure, Confederate statues should come down, but we should leave these Union statues, we should leave the Founding Fathers alone. After all, the Founding Fathers wanted to get rid of slavery. Well, we know from the 1619 Project, that's not what the other side thinks. They want George Washington's head too. They want Jefferson's head and Madison and Monroe. They want to take down the Declaration, the Constitution. They want it all gone. And they want it all gone, maybe not the Declaration because they actually buy into the proposition nation that the neoconservatives push. But they want it all gone because all those things are evil. Just like John C. Calhoun is evil, just like Nathan Bedford Forrest is evil, just like all Southerners are evil because they're Southerners. And if they don't denounce their ancestors, they're evil. You see, this is the other side. And when I say how the Southern tradition can save America, that side can't do anything but consume itself. It is French revolutionary nonsense. It is dangerous and it is highly problematic. And again, this is why we exist at the Institute, because we want to prevent these kind of things. We want to present the counterweight. We are the counterweight to these issues going on in America. And who knows? I mean, all this stuff has been taken off the front page for right now because we've got other bigger things to deal with. But at the end of the day, we know that all this stuff is still out there. It will come back. Just because the coronavirus, the Chinese virus is out there. Even the idea of calling it the Chinese virus, the Wuhan virus, that's now racist. I mean, look at the nonsense of the left. I think if anything else can come of this, maybe the nonsense of the left can be exposed for being the nonsense of the left. I don't know. But when the conservatives buy into it, the neoconservatives, they are part of the problem as well. All right. Well, I hope you enjoyed this week in review at the Abbeville Institute. Until next time, good day.